Okay, I'll get started quickly. My name is Robert Yerex. I'm the chief economist at a company called Kronos. And most of you won't know that company unless you have an hourly job on the side where you punch into a time clock. Just about 90% of everybody in this country who punches into an hourly time clock, electronic time clock, uses one of Kronos's time clocks. I don't actually know much about that part of the business, but the other thing that they do is they do assessments on people that are applying for jobs. And the vast majority, it's very large, about 35 million applications last year. And in the retail space, it's about anywhere between 15 and 25% of everybody who works in the retail hourly space goes through one of their applications. So as an economist there, I do a variety of different things, but I have the opportunity to look at a whole bunch of data about employment and retail sales and things like that. And so quickly, just to give you an idea of what I do. So I'm a practicing macroeconomist. There's not an awful lot of them out there. Most economists are in the government or at universities. And when I'm doing my work, I just put down here a few notes that are important. I have a unified research, development, and production environment, meaning that I have to be able to run everything on a single platform, essentially. Do a lot of complicated calculations, mostly on econometric time series analysis, data intensive, typically running, as I said, about 35 million applications. In fact, that's just for a single year. Most of the analysis I do is multi-year, so there's hundreds of millions of records that go into it. It's a continuous production. Most of you won't have heard of it, but there's what we put out is something called the Retail Labor Index, which gets picked up by all the different wire services. It goes out every month. So I've got this really tight production cycle of about 14 days. And I spend an awful lot of my time that I'm not working on the index itself talking to the press. And most government numbers go out on Fridays. So typical Friday, if my voice sounds a little hoarse, it's because at 5 o'clock our time I was on the phone with various different reporters. They call me every Friday to ask about different things that are going on. So part of what I'm doing here is based on my experience of developing graphics for this kind of a situation. So what I have to do is, as I said, I have to talk to the press. And in a typical interview, you've got about 30 seconds to get your point across. A typical reporter working on a story of, let's say, the unemployment numbers will end up calling about anywhere from a dozen to 20 sources within a few hours. And if you want your information to be put there, or to go out in their article, if you want to be quoted in it, then you have to get your point across very quickly. So I found that visual aids are very effective. Economists often use really long econo-speak. I talked to the gal who is at Dow Jones Newswire, and she does one of their retail sales reports that goes out, and she's quoted in the Wall Street Journal and a number of other places. And she asked me early on, this is about a year or so ago, why consumers weren't buying. And I think I said something like, the intermediate to long-term time horizon over which consumers are deleveraging, and she cut me off and she said, what are you talking, what? And so I said, basically everybody's maxed out their credit card, so there's no money left to spend at the mall. And she said, oh, okay, now I get it. Why didn't you just say that in the first place? So one of the issues of dealing with non-academic economists and non-economists in general is that you have to be able to get the information across quickly, succinctly, and in a repeatable way. So let me go on to the next thing. How many people here have heard of Tufte? Okay, so a guy who's written some books. He's very well known in various different circles. And if you go to one of his talks or get one of his books, it's a very interesting experience. And he would talk about how the visual display of quantitative information has been around for a long time. But nowadays we have these very fancy tools, computerized tools that allow us to do an awful lot of things that end up not meaning an awful lot. And one of the things that he leads off with, you've probably never seen this graphic before, but basically what it is, it's a map of Napoleon's attempted invasion of Russia in the War of 1812. So the brown line shows his troops going in, the black line shows them coming back. And the thickness of the line shows how many of them there were. So even you don't need to know much about this. If somebody tells you this is the map of Napoleon's march to Moscow, you can figure this out pretty quickly. So you don't need to read a bunch of different legends, etc. So it's a wonderful thing to look at. And over the previous couple of hundred years, people developed some very powerful kinds of ways of looking at data. And then when we got to applying computers to them, in some ways we screwed a lot of things up. So this idea of analytical design, so I put down here somewhat the basic purposes or principles of it. The purpose of an analytical display of information is to assist thinking about the evidence. So that's what you should be thinking about when you're putting one of these together. What is it that you're trying to get people to understand from it? So they should be constructed so that in different ways to help us cognitively to grasp what's going on. Describing the data, making comparisons, I do a lot of that. Understanding causality in terms of being able to show a couple of different things together. And cognitively, because mathematically, as an econometrician, I can use all different kinds of formulas and methodology to show that this is a leading indicator, unemployment is a leading indicator of retail sales or something like that. And I can give them all kinds of numbers like that, complicated formulas, but that's not going to end up getting across to most people. Assessing the credibility of data and the analysis that you've done. A couple of important points. The logic of the design should replicate the logic of the analysis, and you'll see what I mean in a little bit. And number 5 here was one of the things that I think is the most important. The interface should be designed first, completely independently. So if I'm not a computer scientist, but I'm reasonable at using some tools like Mathematica. But when I sat down and decided what I wanted a particular display to look like, instead of bringing up Excel or Mathematica or anything else and saying, okay, what do I have? That's a typical thing that you do. You've got a big sheet of data in Excel or something, and so you choose, drop down for the graph, and you pick, okay, what does it look like as this? What does it look like as that? So pretty soon you're stuck within that formula, that set of things that you can use. And those were designed by very smart people that created these different ways of doing graphs, but they created those tools in complete isolation from people that were, from the data they were actually going to be displaying. So, and ultimately spare design, content resolution, so simple designs for complex systems. Just a couple of little things. One of the things you need to be careful of, unfortunately this doesn't show up, it's a little bit too big, but here's a typical map from an election or so ago showing the United States, each of the states colored for whether they're dominantly Republican or Democratic. Kind of thing that you'd see in USA Today all the time. And it seems pretty cool. In fact, in Mathematica, you can pull up maps of different places and superimpose colors on them and do a lot of different stuff. But if I actually want to make that look, if I want to correct that for the fact that the density of population is very different in those areas, this is what the map would look like. Not too useful anymore, but this is actually more truthful than this other map. Because you look at this and you wonder, how would a Democrat ever become president? But when you look at this and look at the density, it makes a lot more sense. So a couple of other early examples of some really interesting things from the 1700s. This is from England. I can't get it all on there. But this is the balance of trade. So there's actually 2 simple lines on here showing imports and exports. But from this, you can very quickly get an idea of, I could do a single graph that would show what the difference of them was. But this gives you that idea of what the volume of that difference was. So it seems like a slight deviation from what you would typically use, but it's something that's much more powerful. You can layer graphics on top of each other. This is an example from 1980, which I guarantee you was done by hand because the tools weren't available at that time, showing some climate data in 3 different ways on the same time axis. So I'm going to quickly go through. I wish I could show this a little bit better. So this is looking at the number of people that applied for retail jobs. Oh, actually, you do see it better over there. Good. For retail jobs in the United States over the last several years. And you can see that it really went way up during the recession. Retail tends to be the place where people that have lost their jobs in other sectors gravitate towards. If figuring that if you can't get a job within your sector, that at least you can bag groceries or flip burgers or do something like that. So, and this is all deseasonalized data using standard econometric techniques. So now we look at the hiring rate, and of course the hiring rate dropped off significantly over that same period of time. So simple single-dimensional graph, nothing special about it. This just is one where I show my data against the data from the BLS to show that they're very comparable, but we actually come out with ours a little bit earlier. I'm also able to determine how long people stay on their job. So this gives you the probability of somebody staying on their job 60 days or more, which doesn't sound like a big deal, but for people that work in a lot of these jobs, you can see that back in 2007, on average, you had a less than 76% chance that somebody who was hired 60 days ago would still be there. And that number has gone well up to 86%, a huge difference. Doesn't sound like a lot, but within the normal dynamics of the marketplace, that's very different. So kind of moving into the idea of looking at two different things at the same time. This is just the ratio of those two, the ratio of the number of people hired to the number of people that are applying for jobs. So it's really looking at the probability, if you're applying for a retail job, of getting that job, and it really dropped off, sadly. So it's down around 3% right now. This is a graph of there's several different consumer sentiment indices out there, and this one is for the University of Michigan. So you can see that it was great back in 2007. It was almost at 100%, which is close to its historical peak. It's an index, so it's mathematically set to be a certain point in time, and I can't remember when their number 100 was set, probably back in 1999, I think. And so this shows it going down over time, coming back a little bit, going back down. I'm showing you these because I'm going to be showing combinations of them, so it's not important that you exactly remember these. So this is retail sales and also food service for places like McDonald's, Burger King, those kinds of places. So you can see that it really dropped off, and this is unitized, meaning that I've taken a period of time and essentially rescaled it to be between 0 and 1 over that period of time, because I'm really just interested in the relative changes here. And this is the kind of smoking gun one. This is the trend in revolving consumer credit. So from 2006 until today, you can see it peaked out very highly in the middle of 2008, at a time where the ratio of our debt to a disposable income was about 137%. And this is a graph of the industrial production for consumer goods. So each of those by themselves is interesting, and if I presented those to somebody in the press or an analyst, you get to the second or third one and their eyes kind of glaze over, and if you could plot a couple of them if you unitize them on the same graph, things like that. But being able to show relationships between them gets to be complicated. And there are lots and lots of different tools that are available. There are 3D surface plots, there are bubble charts, there are all kinds of things that those of us that are used to using them, they make a lot of sense. But if you haven't seen one before, it can take you half an hour to explain a bubble chart to somebody, and if you've got 30 seconds, that is going to be way too long. So one of the first things I looked at doing was imposing color, which doesn't sound like a big deal. And I looked at lots of different ways of doing it. Mathematica is the only tool I've ever found where I could get into the graphics to the point where I could do this. Because what I'm doing here is, the line is the index, the trajectory of the index. We saw that earlier where I said it got down to about 2 or 3% in here. It's come back a little bit. But I've colored that line. I've created a scale of color, blue being low, so that's when consumer confidence is low, blue, and green being when it's high. And I superimposed that on this other data. But it's not one of the scales that's within the graph itself. So you can't simply say, draw me a list line plot and use the Y values for the color. Because the Y values are what's putting this chart up here. But you can use color function. I'll actually show you some code a little bit later. Here's what it looks like when I take the retail sales index. Well, let me go quickly back to that other one. So you can see that the index was high, and it started coming down But it took some time before consumer sentiment really picked up with that. But it dropped off dramatically, and it started to come back up at the end of last year, but we're back in a position where jobs continue to be difficult to obtain and consumer sentiment is quite low. On this one, I superimposed on top of the line that indicates the index, I put on the retail sales. So interestingly enough here, the index is saying that we're going to have some problems in the future because it's a good leading indicator of future economic state. But people are still spending a lot. Retail sales really didn't start to drop off until July of 2008, and then really dropped off in a hurry. And they've since started to come back up. Where it gets really interesting, though, I think, is when you move into essentially the next dimension. So now I've got three different pieces of information that I want to be able to display. The trajectory of the line, just like it has been for the last few graphs, is the index itself. But now I've manipulated the thickness of the line, and the thickness of the line in this graph is the relative change in employee retention. So as it gets thicker, it means that people are more likely to stay on the job longer. And the color is coded to the unemployment rate. So you can see that the index was high, started to drop off. Unemployment, and you would expect that these two are very highly related. Retail sector tends to be the area where unemployment changes happen first. Manufacturing is one of the areas where they happen last. And we'll see that in another graph in a minute. So as the index dropped, people were staying longer because they were concerned for their jobs. They weren't looking for other jobs, and the unemployment rate started to rise. So this is showing three different pieces of information, actually four, because it's showing applications for retail jobs, hires for retail jobs. Those two things are combined in the index itself. And then I'm superimposing the unemployment rate on top of that, as well as the propensity to stay on the job. Now, this is one of the ones that, that for me has been probably the most powerful one I've made. I had the opportunity last March and then again during the summer to go to Washington and talk to economists in the administration of the Federal Reserve about some of the issues that I was seeing. And so here's a graph that I created. So the line of the graph is showing me thousands of unemployed people. So it's actually essentially millions. So we've got 16 million unemployed by the time you get up to this number. And then what I did with this is the thickness of the graph is the unemployment rate. And the color of the graph here is the percentage of those people unemployed who had been so for 27 weeks or more. So now it's showing that the number of people unemployed is rising dramatically. So therefore, the unemployment rate, the thickness of the line is also getting thicker. But what's most important here is that the color of the line is going from this dark color to red. And by the time May came along, and it's actually since gotten worse, 46% of people that were unemployed by May had been unemployed for at least 6 months. And so last summer, you might remember that in July, long-term unemployment benefits were allowed, the emergency long-term unemployment benefits were allowed to lapse. And there was lots of discussion about how that was going to impact the the economy. And I was pushing for the idea that unemployment, the emergency unemployment benefits that people were getting paid on the order of $300 a week, that if they didn't reinstate that by the end of August, it would take a $3.2 billion hit out of retail sales. And so I had a hard time explaining some of that. Well, some of it was really obvious. When you have somebody who's been out of work for 6 months and you give them $300, they're probably spending it on food or rent or things that they absolutely have to have, as opposed to saving it or spending it on something else. And it was this graph where I was able to show that consumer confidence had begun to pick up. So the line on the graph here is consumer confidence. And the thickness of the line here is sales. So that had begun to improve again. But the color of the line is showing the percentage of people that are unemployed for, like I said, 6 months or more. And you can see, just visually, you can see what those relationships were. I didn't have to go through some complicated mathematics to explain that. And I mean, dozens and dozens of people, it's not really testifying, dozens and dozens of people were in discussions about this. And in the end, it does impact how policymakers decide which things they're going to push very hard for and you know, call in favors, etc. So this is the code, and I'd like to, of a particular example, and I won't actually run it, but this, it generates this here, which shows another very important relationship in the economy currently. So industrial production, unitized again, is the line of the graph here. The unemployment rate is the color of the graph, and the thickness of the graph here is retail sales on a relative basis. So when you hear the term jobless recovery, this is what it looks like. So you can see that production went way down, and actually sales dropped off well before production did. It took the producers a while to realize that things they were making weren't being sold. And it took a while for the unemployment rate to really crank up. But we're essentially now in September, this numbers are through the end of September. Most retailers have, major retailers have weathered the storm. If you average the profitability of all retail chains over $50 million, their profitability is currently around 3%. So not a great place to be, but a lot better than they were 6 or 12 months ago. But you can see that employment hasn't picked back up. So we've reached this kind of new equilibrium, which is probably going to be slightly about 20% lower sales than it was before. But unfortunately, we have this big issue with long-term unemployment. So quickly, since I just have 2 minutes, so I say here, help wanted. So if you get a chance to look at my code, you'll see it's an example of some really wacky hacking. So I figured out some of these effects over time, how to color this line based on using the color function that's actually doing a call out to a completely different function that knows what the unemployment rate was at any point along this graph, even though unemployment rate isn't one of the values that's going into the graph directly itself. Same with the thickness of the line. So there's lots of issues that I have to deal with. And so, as I said, I'm looking for anybody who would be willing to take a look at this and actually tell me how I should have done it. And so that's basically what I wanted to cover. And if people are interested in this kind of graphical technique, some places to look for inspiration are in the Tufte books, and he's got a website. And if you want to take a look, I was going to say, so there's also, this is the website for the Kronos Retail Labor Index, like I said, comes out every month. And if you do a Google on it, you'll see that just for the last one that went out a couple of weeks ago, it's about 8,000 hits. So it's something that's very popular. It gets used by a lot of analysts, etc. It's something that's freely available. My company does it strictly for the PR value. And so there's no commercial interest directly in it. So any questions? I think I only have a few seconds. And again, if anybody's interested in it, all of the information is available on the website, and I'd be more than happy to send you the code if you promise not to laugh at it. So, thank you.